Welcome to Modern Animism, a holistic spiritual path. I'm your host, Laura Giles. Thanks for tuning in. You know, one of the things that people don't often talk about, but we really should, is spiritual narcissism. So spirituality is a big business. It attracts a lot of people who have big egos. They want you to follow them and worship them, and then they end up taking advantage of you and hurting you. So there's lots of articles about ayahuasca retreats where people are sexually assaulted, for example. So today, my guest, Jennifer Moore, and I are going to explore that. Jennifer is the author of Empathic Mastery, a 5-step system to go from emotional hot mess to thriving success. She's the host of Empathic Mastery Show on News for the Soul Radio and has tons of skills and products that I hope that she's going to share with us today on our talk. But before we dive in with that, let's not forget to give gratitude to the ancestors and elements. I thank the element of earth for keeping us stable, balanced, and keeping us firmly grounded. I send gratitude for our physical bodies that helps us to enjoy life in the physical realm. All the stars that we see, the bird songs that we hear, the flowers and strawberries that we taste and smell at this time of year, and the emotions that we feel. For all these sensuous things that make a physical life challenging, amazing, and feeling alive, I thank you. I acknowledge and thank the element of air for inspiring us with ideas and giving us the means to communicate them to each other and in the spirit realm. Our ideas are the sparks that bring new things to life, so thank you. I acknowledge and thank the element of fire for the drive that puts our actions and ideas into real life things. And I thank you for the balance of responsibility that keeps us from being hedonistic, selfish, or wanton, so that we serve others as we serve ourselves. Such an important thing to balance, that we don't encroach on each other's boundaries. Thank you, fire. I acknowledge the element of water, and thank you for sustaining our lives and reminding us to go with the flow. I acknowledge and thank our loving, helping ancestors from the human, plant, animal, and mineral kingdoms. Thank you for all the help that we receive that is seen and unseen. And I thank our listening community for tuning in and coming on over to our private groups in MeWe and Facebook to join the conversation and send us questions. And if any of our shows inspire or help you, please consider donating to keep us going. And if you want to support in other ways, write us a review on iTunes. It helps our Google rating so that others can find us more easily. So I know you want to hear from our guests, right? So welcome, Jennifer Moore.
Thank you so much, Laura. It is so good to be here. And just even your little teaser at the beginning, I'm like, ooh, this is going to be so juicy.
Girlfriend, you have a really interesting life story. So I would love it if we could start there.
Absolutely. Yes, I do have a really interesting life story. And I in some ways, I think I'm one of those people who just kind of always kind of went, I wonder how we could make this happen. And, I've been very, very, very lucky and very blessed to go after dreams. That said, I also have been an extremely highly sensitive and intuitive person from the time I was a very, very little girl. And so I experienced a lot of anxiousness and social, just feeling out of sorts and feeling like an outsider, and knowing, like the kids knew I was not the same as the rest of them. And I didn't really know how to cope with that because, growing up as a kid, I was a kid in the 70s, and growing up in the 70s, aside from Star Trek and the Empath episode, there was just nobody talking about what it means to be aware of something larger than yourself. And if you started talking about intuitive abilities or picking up on things that were going on in the greater world, I was growing up in a family of, my mother was a psychiatric nurse who worked as a psychotherapist, and my father was a social worker, and I come from medical model family. So everybody was just like, that's all in your head. Isn't that cute? She has such a great imagination. So I definitely got to spend some time working through what it's like to know things and be invalidated for what you know. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a little piece of my childhood. ask a question, tell me what is it particularly that you were thinking
There was
about?
just so many things that I read about you. I mean, we could do 10 shows on you and just not even scratch the surface. So I just kind of wanted people who are tuning in to just, kind of have an idea of who's in front of them.
Yeah.
It is really interesting.
Well, so I guess the short version is that, I was an awkward, magical child who really, didn't get along well with the Muggles, didn't know how to fit in with the Muggles, but grew up in a Muggle world. For anybody who's not familiar with the Harry Potter term Muggle, that is the idea of those who are non-magical, who tend to perceive the world through, very much through sort of that insulation of it's all, it's only them that they're perceiving and experiencing. And I grew up in, a lily white town in Massachusetts where we had more banks and churches than any other institutions. And so it was a very strange place to be, somebody who talked to the rocks and talked to the plants and talked to the trees and believed that there were unseen things all around me, and really and also had past life memories very, very early and all of that. So but art was something that really drew me. So I started making art and wanting to become an artist. So I got out of my small town when I was 17, and I went off to actually an early admissions college for a little while, but then I went to art school. So I have an undergraduate degree in fine arts. And then I spent some time, I discovered that it was easier to make money as a psychic than it was as an artist. So I actually started reading cards for a living and teaching intuitive development and psychic skills with people. And that actually led me to realize, because when I first started reading cards, I was really curious about what will happen to people. I was very interested in sort of fate and destiny, and thinking in terms of life is something that happens to you, not something that you engage with and make choices about. But what I discovered as I personally started doing my own work on the impact of being so highly sensitive, and part of that was about the fact that I had to admit that I was binging on sugar and it was making my life completely unmanageable. And so I quit smoking, gained 40 pounds, and basically ended up on my emotional knees, acknowledging that I had a problem with body image, with and basically an eating disorder and a sugar addiction. And so as I started to look at my own stuff and do my own personal work, what I started to discover in doing work as an intuitive was that I was really, instead of it being, you're going to meet a tall, dark cesspool and fall in, and people come, when am I going to meet my tall, dark cesspool? How many children am I going to have with them? My questions started to be, and I started working with people more in, why are you continuously attracted to tall, dark cesspools?
Yeah.
And what can you do to stop this? As well as, if somebody would ask me the question, how many kids am I going to have? I would literally look at them and say, how many do you want to have? Yeah. It's sort of like, these are big questions to be leaving up to fate. And that led me to realize that I needed to develop skills as a healer, because what I found was that so much of what was driving our bus as human beings had to do with unreconciled events from the past, whether it was, and just big T trauma and little t traumas, as well as collective experiences. And I realized, at first it started with how to deal with healing the difficult past events and traumatic stuff from this lifetime. And then I started realizing we needed to not only heal stuff from this lifetime, but we really needed to address karmic wounds, things that happened in previous lives, as well as addressing ancestral legacies, as you know, because not only is there sort of the encoded stuff that's in our DNA, but then there's also a whole bunch of ancestral agreements and belief systems and contracts and everything that we're all up against, and that needs to be addressed and cleared if we want to live a life of choice as opposed to a life of fate.
Yeah. Get off that hamster wheel.
Yeah.
So, you covered a ton of ground there.
I did.
I'm going to go back to empath. So when you say that word, what do you mean exactly?
Thank you. So first off, I want to say that very, very basically, I think most people would agree that empathy is the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, mm-hmm. to imagine what their experience is. And I think sympathy is, there's sort of the distinction between sympathy and empathy is that I think sympathy tends to have the ability to recognize that somebody is going through a hard time, but not necessarily to feel what it would be like or imagine that experience. It's sort of like, wow, really sucks to be them, that they're going through that. Good thing it's not me. And empathy is like that deep sense, that felt sense of like knowing on an emotional level what it is like to experience something. Now, I believe that empathy is, and empath, it's a scale. And actually, we've got sort of like the narcissism and, psychopaths on one side of it and empaths on the other side of it. And that there's a continuum, and that I think most people tend to fall somewhere in the middle where they have a capacity to imagine what other people would be feeling, but not feeling it directly. And sort of on the scale, on the side of narcissists, everything is about them, it's the 24/7, like me show. And there's absolutely everything is simply other human beings are more like just a reflection of them and so there's no awareness of how that other person is actually feeling. And empaths on the other side of the spectrum are people who not only can imagine what people are thinking and feeling, but who actually take on and absorb the thoughts, feelings, energy, sensations of the people and often of the world around them. And there are some people who may be sensitive, where, your boss is having a bad day, you go into work, you feel out of sorts, and then you realize it's because your boss is feeling out of sorts. But then there are people who are so sensitive that they're picking up on the world, that they're picking up on the geopathic stress, that they're picking up on things going on in different time frames. They're picking up on things that happened in the past, things that are going to be happening in the future. And what I've been seeing with this pandemic is that because of the level of collective stress that we are experiencing as a planet right now, many people who had the ability to kind of compartmentalize and insulate or kind of protect themselves from feeling all the feels about what's going on in the world, that's been wearing thin. And a lot more people are coming into a higher level of empathy, and many people are waking up into being empaths in a way that I think is unprecedented. And so many people, I think right now, are struggling for the first time with, why am I feeling so strange? Why am I feeling so distressed? Why am I feeling so, XYZ, when there's nothing wrong in my own life, when I'm not, like I'm okay. And I think that what is going on the planet right now, we're going through this massive global shift, and I believe a birthing of a new world and an awakening. Whether we awaken, what we awaken into has a lot to do with the choices we make. But I really believe that we're going through this, and part of it is that more and more people are coming into their awareness of their interconnection with absolutely everything on the planet.
So that sounds, if I didn't have that ability before and that's started happening to me now, that sounds pretty horrible. Is there a way to tone it down or get it under control in some way?
Yes, and there are so many different pieces to the work we need to do in order to navigate it. And one of the problems that I've seen, and I've experienced myself, and I've also seen so many other people do, is that you can't suppress it without it going sideways. I always have this image of, that contact paper that the sticky paper that they used to put over shelves all the time. And it was inevitable that you'd have a bubble in the middle of the piece of paper, and you'd try to push that bubble down and move the bubble around, push it down and push it out. But it never failed. The bubble would just go someplace else. And that's the thing about being highly sensitive, trying to put a lid on it, trying to ignore it, trying to shut it down. The problem with that is it just tends to go sideways. And so we can't necessarily just ignore it. I've known so many people who, especially when they were younger, they had maybe a negative premonition, something, they anticipated a death or something else. And so they suppressed their abilities. But the problem with that is that it doesn't suppress the abilities. It just makes it harder to access. And it comes out sideways. It comes out as physical health issues. It comes out as as anxiousness. It comes out as nightmares. It comes out in all kinds of different ways, but it doesn't necessarily disappear. And a lot of us, alcoholism, drug use, sugar addiction in my case, cigarette smoking, compulsive shopping, binge watching, all kinds of behaviors that we use for self-soothing. They work to some extent, but the problem with everything is that it doesn't necessarily address the root cause. And what I will say is that I think that one of the long-term solution for dealing with being highly sensitive and empathic is learning how to be okay with discomfort. Because what I have found is that highly sensitive and empathic people, we pick up other people's feelings. And if we're not comfortable with our own uncomfortable feelings, we're going to be really uncomfortable with other people's uncomfortable feelings. And so understanding how to sit with the depths of grief, with the depths of loneliness, with rage, with all kinds of different intense emotions, if we can learn how to do this, then we don't need to fix something. Instead, we can be present with it and acknowledge what's going on. Now, I'm not going to say that it makes it necessarily comfortable. One of the things I've been experiencing in the last year since the pandemic started is that I've had generally anywhere between 10 to 14 days prior to something really intense happening, I've been waking up at about 5 o'clock in the morning with my heart pounding, heart palpitations, feeling like I'm plugged into an electric socket. And one of the first and most intense ones was about 2 weeks before my dad died from COVID. And so yes, to anybody who's listening who has not yet known anybody who has lost somebody to COVID, congratulations, now you do. But when I was experiencing that, I didn't know what was going on, and it was very, very, very disconcerting, and it was very, very disorienting. But I had the tools, like I've I've been doing the work for long enough to know, okay, I'm okay. I can breathe. I can be present. And I started to understand as I just kept on moving through the process of now when these blips come up, I'm like, yep, another surge is coming. So by no means do I want to say like, yeah, it's a cakewalk to be this sensitive. But I also think that the reason why we're so uncomfortable is that we've been living in a lie, for some people would say, for 4,500 years. With the onset of agriculture and the onset of separating ourselves from each other, that in a lot of ways it's like, it's that thing of like when your nervous system comes back online after something has been dulled and numbed for a really long time, it kind of feels like pins and needles. And I think that we cannot deny what we are. We cannot deny that we are interconnected. Like you and I are part of the same body. You and I are cells in the same body. And you and I exist as something so much greater than ourselves. And the lie that empire, which is a term that my friends, Clark Strand and Perdita Finn, who wrote an amazing book called The Way of the Rose, which is, if you do not know this book, it's absolutely incredible, talking about the encoded earth-based mysteries within the rosary. But they refer to the idea of empire and the idea of how empire has been sort of really just directing the story for a very long time. And one of the things that empire does is it has been selling us this lie that we're individuals, that we are separate, that we are not part of a greater whole. And so I think so many people have been kind of in this sort of weird sort of, kind of like isolated place. And now that separation is sort of being melted off, I think a lot of people are feeling the discomfort because it's like that nervous system coming back online, and suddenly it's like pins and needles everywhere.
Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things I think about animism is that if you grew up in it like I did, that's just kind of how it's always been, and you kind of get that sometimes you're uncomfortable. I don't think that there's an expectation that there's going to be happily ever after, or that I'm done and now I'm always connected, or anything in the cycle is ever the same. It's always changing.
Well, and you said something in one of the episodes I was listening to, you just said this piece where I was like, I'm listening, I'm cooking in the kitchen and I'm listening. I'm like, yes, yes. And you were talking about death and about how within animism, and while I don't necessarily use the word animism, you and I are so completely on the same page with all of this. And it's funny because I wasn't raised in a family that believed it, but I was this way even as a small child, and I knew it. Like, I just knew these things. But you were talking about animism understands that death is part of the equation. Mm-hmm. And that actually in some ways kind of leads to the thing that you kind of dropped the teaser about at the beginning of this, of the show, about spiritual narcissism. Mm-hmm. And, and about this whole sort of these like big foo-foo leaders who are so invested in, their self-aggrandizement. And, I think one of the things that I see within that is also so frequently within the New Age and spiritual communities, there's a denial of death. Like I was part of, for a number of years, I was eating a very sort of, spiritually correct diet. I'm not going to necessarily go into the specifics of the diet, but I was eating a really spiritually correct diet. And one of the things sort of at the very end of the spectrum were people who considered themselves or who believed that you could exist on breath and sunlight alone.
I've heard that.
And yeah. And the thing is that, and the idea also was this, if you ate the right foods, and you did the right things and you got the right supplements, somehow you could prolong your life for, like there was this quality of like immortality was the goal, and longevity is the goal. And part of me is like, it's a complete setup for human beings to, if you're regarding problems with the body, just the inevitability of a human body breaking down as being a problem, it's sort of like, it's really unfortunate because it's kind of encoded into the equation.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, with everything is sacred and everything is connected, do you have a theory about how the empath and narcissists are maybe attracted to each other? So what I'm kind of talking about is like the twin flame thing.
Yes.
A lot of people feel like this is, I don't know, desirable maybe.
Well, okay. So the thing about the empath and the narcissist is that for the narcissist, it's all about them. And for the empath, it's all about them, in terms of it's all about the narcissist. Mm-hmm. I believe that the reason why empaths and narcissists are so utterly attracted to each other, and in some ways it's like the opposite ends of the scale, that both of them, that they tend to find their way to each other. But I believe that the empath and narcissist on an emotional, more interpersonal level relationship, and even probably on the grander scale of like the narcissistic spiritual leader, that the thing about it is that at first it is absolutely a match made in heaven. There is nothing more exquisite, because the thing is that the empath by their nature is picking up all the thoughts, feelings, energy, sensations of the narcissist, and the narcissist is basking in the glow of both the attention that they're getting from the narcissist, the pleasure that they are giving the narcissist, because the empath is feeling all the pleasure that the narcissist is feeling. And that's creating a feedback loop where the empath feels fantastic. So they're getting all this yummy, juicy, like deliciousness coming from picking up on all the stuff that the narcissist is feeling. And so both parties are feeling fantastic in the very beginning of it. And the narcissist not only gets to bask in all of the attention and all of the validation and all of the acknowledgement, but also the fact that the empath feels so good being around them is a reflection of how awesome they are. So it really starts off for most people, and for most of, the empath narcissist combo is an absolutely amazing combo. And I think you're right that a lot of people, when they first encounter that empath narcissist fusion, it does feel like a soulmate. It does feel like a twin flame. It does feel like, oh, I've been waiting for you my entire life. And, and what I have discovered or seen being around many empathic women, especially, and interestingly, there does tend to be a gender distinction that more frequently narcissism, and especially narcissistic personality disorder, tends to manifest more with men than with women. I actually think that narcissistic women are much better at, they do it in a different way. I don't think that necessarily we don't have narcissistic women as much as what we identify as a narcissist in our culture tends to fall into the categories that males tend to be more entitled to, or behaviors that males tend to do. But, in general, we tend to have the narcissist is male and the empath is female. So one of the things I've seen again and again is when children come into the equation, because the narcissist often will want to have kids partially as a reflection of them, that it's mini-me's. But the problem is that when any woman has a child, any parent who's the primary parenting person, caretaking, has kids, the priorities radically shift. And where they used to have time to dote on the narcissist, suddenly there is somebody more important. And that's where I have seen pretty much in every single marriage with kids between a narcissist and an empath, that is the place where I have seen things break down and basically the relationship just like cease to be able to function effectively because it's no longer all about them.
That makes sense. So what about in the case of the spiritual guru, is there a breaking point for that?
It's been, so one of the things I absolutely love is watching documentaries and reading about cults, persuasion, and human vulnerability. I actually, as an undergraduate, one of the best courses I ever took as an undergraduate was a class literally called Cults, Persuasion, and Human Vulnerability. And, I'll just make a plug for, there's a couple new series that came out within the last year that are really fascinating to deconstruct. One's called The Vow. It's about the NXIVM cult. And the other one is Seduction. That's also about the NXIVM cult. And I don't know if you're familiar with this cult, but led by this very, very powerful man who had been trained in NLP, or actually, I don't even know if he trained in NLP, but worked with somebody else. But this guy basically created this really, 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 really large cult that involved sex trafficking and manipulating people. I mean, it's like the stuff of movies. It's like, it's so crazy, the stuff that these people do. I mean, I think that part of me is just like, I guess that what I would say is that from a more meta or broadening out standpoint, I think that one of the problems in our world right now is that everybody in our culture has been breathing the oxygen that is reinforcing the lie, or has been sort of infused in an operating system that is telling us that we are disconnected, that we are separate, that we are individuals, and that believes that there is only one pie with with finite pieces, and that if you get yours, I won't get mine.
Right.
And so there's this perception of scarcity. And, thinking about the phenomenon of the need to wear the crown, the need to be seen as the person who has all the answers, the need to be seen as the person above. At the core of it is, I think, the wound that we are separate, and that only by aggrandizing ourselves or lifting ourselves up do we become, can we somehow solve the problem?
Right.
And yet the problem with this is that the greed monster wants more and more and more. And so what I've noticed in regards to cults is that, or in terms of and in terms of these really big spiritual leaders, is that a lot of times, if they cease to be grounded, if they cease to be humble, if they are doing things for their own better gain, it seems like eventually things topple. And I mean, I'm sure you and I could list, you and I could probably list 100 different scenarios where either financial or sexual abuse or both basically sort of came to the surface, and eventually the entire structure started to unravel and come apart. And, while you don't have necessarily they had a kid and now the kid's needs are more important than the leader's needs, I do think that the running of an organization, that there just comes a point where the system doesn't work. It starts to break down because the needs of the whole are not being acknowledged. I mean, I think about,
right. Yeah.
I was just thinking about Bhagwan Rajneesh and, his fleet of Rolls Royces. And if I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but if anybody is interested in a really, really juicy documentary series, it's called Wild Wild Country. And it really just unpacks the insidiousness, because within that structure, it wasn't just him. There were other people who were going for the power grab, and who were power hungry, and who were manipulating the system, and who were using the system for their personal gain as well. So it was kind of like this spectacular train wreck to watch what was happening.
I think it also exists in things like law of attraction, or you have these success coaches, that kind of thing. I mean, it's sometimes it's wrapped in a spirituality blanket, but when we're talking about, making all this money, and you're worshiping at the altar of this person and that person, and you just have to do this and you're going to be enough. I mean, I think that's another reflection of the same thing.
I absolutely agree. And I mean, ever since I've been around, because of the way that the healing world works, there's a lot of interface, or there's a lot of overlap between spiritual healing and the new age world. And so I've been around law of attraction for a long time. And I will never forget, like, one of the very first times I started hearing that you create your own reality, and I looked around me, and I'm in a room full of white people, and I'm in a room full of white people with a lot of privilege. And the thing that I have never, ever been able to reconcile, and I have never been able to completely understand, is how is it that nearly everybody who's talking about creating their own reality and choosing their birth and choosing their experience are people who've coming from good fortune, who are coming from having the circumstance of winning the privilege lottery. And I think that there is a lot of blindness in the ideas of, you create your own reality, and if it sucks, then that's your problem and you need to do something about it. I think it is. And there's some really, and this is not my area of expertise. I've listened to stuff about this, but so I'll just say, if this is a rabbit hole somebody wants to go down, do your research. But there's a really, really strong correlation between fascism and white supremacy and the building up of the original teachings of New Thought. And so I believe that this world that there is infinite abundance on this planet. And I also believe that the biggest problem on our planet is basically the belief in scarcity and lack, and the idea that if we let everybody have what they need, somehow we'll be deficient. So right. I do believe the solution is abundance, and the solution is generosity, and the solution is love. But I think that there's this way that some of the law of attraction stuff, and also, the whole coaching industry, I'm sort of going down a tangent here, but I can't tell you how many times in the last year I have just rolled my eyes and either unfollowed somebody or unsubscribed, or just been like, oh no, you didn't, because they're talking about pivoting in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, these people who are like, oh, this is my opportunity to launch my dream business. And I'm just like, no, this is the opportunity to save your life. This is the opportunity to make sure that you stay out of harm's way. And every single person I've worked with privately has struggled with the fact that they have not been able to do all the things. And when we start talking about what has come into their life in the last year, most people's responsibilities to their families, to their children, to just the basic things of just chopping wood and carrying water has exponentially grown. Like, one person I know had been doing a certain thing. She had a part-time job where she spent 5 to 9 hours a week doing it. That got replaced with homeschooling her children and managing the Zoom for 30 hours a week.
Wow.
Plus dealing with the kids.
Yeah.
And then, but our society, and like, especially this whole kind of new agey coaching thing, has all these people who keep on basically sort of selling this myth of you can have it all, and that, oh, you can take this opportunity and pivot with it and turn it into something. So I think that, to go back to what I was saying before, I think the problem with so much of the new age and spiritual world is that even though it has a sense of abundance and a sense of possibility, we've all been breathing the air that is lying to us about how disconnected we are.
Yeah, I guess groundedness is not sexy. It doesn't sell.
Groundedness is not sexy. Grieving is not sexy, and I think, and that fits into the whole aspect of spiritual bypassing, of like that somehow feeling uncomfortable is a sign of there being something wrong,
right,
as opposed to an inevitability of being in a human body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I were a narcissist, do I have any hope?
In the long game, absolutely. I guess what I would say is, I think that when it comes to narcissism, some of it would have to do with how cognitively capable are they of recognizing their own place in it. And if you believe that narcissism arises out of wounds and arises out of damage, that in some ways a lot of it would have to do with how young or how early on in the journey is it getting caught, how motivated or invested in actually changing are they. And so I think, sadly, there are some narcissists who will go to their grave believing that the world done them wrong and will never have the ability to recognize their own part in it. But I do think that there are some people who can see, oh, this is where it's at, because, I also think that the idea that empaths and narcissists are completely separate entities is also kind of the idea, that sort of duality and separation idea. I mean, we all have empathic abilities within us, and we all have narcissistic abilities within us. And I think that a lot of times, one of the things that empaths need to own is what's driving our bus and what's making us tick. That, that in order to shift things, even for an empath, it has to do with mindfully being aware of what are we doing, why are we doing it, and can we make a different choice? Which kind of leads me back to the whole thing of being able to sit with discomfort. And I also, I also think that one of the things I can say for myself that made a huge difference was, in order to stop being attracted to emotionally unavailable, gaslighting narcissists, and people with, personality disorders in general, and I will say that there have been a couple, even in the early days, there were a couple really dear, sweet, creative, lovely boyfriends, but there were also some real doozies. But what I will say is that it wasn't until I was willing to look into the void of loneliness and accept the experience of my own feelings of desolateness, of my own feelings of existential disconnection, and learn how to self-soothe, learn how to hold my own heart and be like, I hear you, you're hurting, you're scared, you're lonely, and not jump into a relationship. Like that, I think that loneliness motivates us a lot, and And it comes out of I mean, in a non-animistic society, when we're all disconnected, we don't have our ancestors to give us a pat on the back when we're absolutely bereft.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't have the sense. And as a magical, I mean, it's funny, the word I found, the closest word I ever found when I was in graduate school or seminary to what I identify as a panentheist, which is, you know, and panentheism is very much animism of everything is alive, everything is sacred, everything is divine, God is everywhere, is everything. And I grew up in a family of atheists. And so I've had the experience of waking up and being in the world and everything is interconnected and I can see the matrix of connection mm-hmm. everywhere mm-hmm. and it is exquisite and it's beautiful and all is well in my world. And I've also had the experience of waking up on these days where it's like all I can feel is me and the sky is just a sky and mm-hmm. a tree is just a tree and everything looks kind of like hollow and concrete and I can't feel anything. And when I'm in those states, which I believe is why we're the way we are right now in general. But when I'm in those states, especially when I was younger and I got into those states, it was much more likely that I was going to grab a cigarette, that I was going to mm-hmm. grab a drink, that I was going to grab a bag of M&Ms, that I was going to go, that I was going to go cruising and go find the next love of my life who was going to save me. So I know I just sort of took that and pivoted with it in terms of you were asking about narcissists and their ability to change. And I sort of said, yes. And I also think that the bottom line is the other thing is narcissists don't necessarily need to change until people stop enabling them. And empaths enable them. Yeah. And I do believe that one of the biggest things that happens and one of the reasons why the empath and empath narcissist combo keeps happening is because when you do the, you know, there's that old joke about, you know, like hopefully this isn't politically incorrect, but the old joke about two lesbians and the U-Haul, you know, it's like on the second date, they bring the U-Haul. And I think that could easily be true with the empath as well, that the empath brings the U-Haul on the second date. It's like, I remember as a child, or not a child, a young adult in my 20s, I would go on a date with somebody and I would start calculating the genetic odds for blue eyes within the second frickin' date. You know, and the thing about that is that when we are ready to sell ourselves down the river, when we are ready to marry ourselves off after one encounter or after tumbling into bed after like on the first night, the problem with that is that we do not have the time to discern if the person is appropriate. And so we've already given into the combo. And by the time we start recognizing that somebody is a narcissist, it's too late. We're bonded, we're invested, and we care. And so I have found that the key, which as a kid, I was like, oh, that's so prudish. And but that the key is, you got to take your time to find out what you're dealing with. Yeah. And like it or not, sex is an incredibly effective way to create bonds and cords between two human beings. Mm-hmm. And once the sex has happened, it's intoxicating. You lose the ability to use your head. Your head goes offline. And your soul and your body and your spirit and your energy system becomes invested in a specific outcome because you've started the bonding process with somebody. Yeah.
Awesome. Like I said, we could do 10 shows.
We could. Absolutely. We could totally do 10 shows. I mean, this is stuff I'm so passionate about and I have been thinking about for such a long time. And when you wrote and said, hey, you want to talk about narcissists and empaths, I was just thrilled because it's such an important topic.
Sure is. Yeah. I appreciate you so much being here. This is awesome.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
So can you tell our audience how to find you and where
absolutely
to know more about your book, your work?
Yes, please. So absolutely. So probably the easiest thing to do is to go to the hub, which is empathicmastery.com. And there you can find access to the book. You can find access to the empathic safe, and to the, going and getting like sign up and get my mini course for how to do empathic safety. If you actually buy the book, there's a big bonus gift in it for people that has an entire system of like, okay, so you're struggling. This is what you do, this is what to do first. Because as I sort of hinted, it's a process to really find your way with being highly sensitive empathic. And most people need relief now. And so what I've done is in the book, I have sort of the 5-step system of recognize, release, protect, connect, and act. But then I also have sort of the cheat sheet, the crib notes of these are the things that if you need relief now, these are the things that you can do. And I will say, in my personal experience and working with a lot of other people, one of the things that can be surprisingly effective is look at your sugar intake. And actually, like if you are consuming a lot of sugar, cutting down or eliminating sugar, processed sugar in particular, as well as looking at what's your relationship with drugs and alcohol, those are places where you can start to make a difference. But then another thing is the tool that I absolutely love and has been life-changing for me is tapping, or EFT, emotional freedom techniques, and learning the basic recipe of how to use tapping to calm your nervous system down is something that will allow it to be possible to continue to say no to sugar, to continue to walk away from the cigarette, and to sit with the loneliness in a way that when we don't have effective tools, we're much more likely to just go back to the thing that worked. Because unlike some people who might be like, oh, that's so bad, what I honestly believe is absolutely everything we do because it's the thing that was the closest to working, and that it was the solution that worked. And it's really mean of us to beat the crap out of ourselves about like, well, look at you have a drug problem, or you have a this or a that. It's like, yeah, that's because that was the one best option I had. So I really believe that part of the solution is about learning how to find better options.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So go head on over to my world, empathicmastery.com, go grab a copy of the book, and sign up for my newsletter, which will lead you into a whole like sort of welcome to my world, basically. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being here. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next week on Modern Animism Radio. Thanks.